Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to review something, and if you'd like to get something reviewed, feel free to pop into my Discord and, well, just ask. We're going to read the README, and then we're going to continue with looking at some code and me just mentioning ad hoc what I think about it. It's not going to be an in-depth review. I've always loved the idea of headless content management systems that can generate a web API with almost no code, but extending the system itself can get tricky. Many tools store the structure of created collections in a database or a file, so whenever I want to extend a repository class, I have to fetch the model from wherever it's stored and figure out the types. It works, but it can be tedious and hard to maintain. On top of that, every major release of the CMS brings its own challenges. And because types are loaded at runtime, there's no way for IntelliSense to know what type a model has. I am not familiar with content management systems of this kind, since I mostly develop applications greenfield, so I can't speak to that, but I feel like it should be possible to write a plugin for IntelliSense to be able to parse the model file, either from the database or from whatever file it has, and then provide you that knowledge. There are similar plugins for like GraphQL specifications, etc. Depending on the language, of course, and frameworks, and it's quite possible that the framework also has a more unified model specification language, which I don't know. Something to look into, potentially. That's the reason I decided to build a tool that works differently. It lets the user create the bare minimum for their application, and when they want to extend it, they can export the collections and the logic into code files and continue from there. No guessing, no hidden structures. Just clean, maintainable code. And to make it feel more developer-friendly, the tool should also take care of setting up and configuring other tools for the app's needs. Like Dockerizing the app, setting up database server if it doesn't exist. Okay, so we roughly know what it does. Naming conventions, library, the code for my front end, the bookshelf, which is lowercase, the application that contains the whole logic, the collection, model classes, entity classes, whatever. Books are filed that is stored in the collection, a filed. A file? I'm not sure what that means. Category, generated enums. Use cases. Developers should be able to automate. Oh, that's the interesting part. That's what it's supposed to do. The developer should be able to automatically establish a database connection and set up the database only for the case that the DB does not exist. The app should allow the user to create bare minimum for the application logic. The application should manage authentication and authorization and help the user to configure auth to third-party system services like Google, GitHub, Steam, etc., presumably OAuth, etc. The apps should be able to fetch data from an API, select fields the developer wants to deal with, and save the fields and the data in the database. The application should be able to provide the developer with an email server, a debug server, or a full proper simple mail server. GraphQL support, WebSocket support, gRPC, MCP. We got a overview of the application. Developer interacts with the front end of a web API with the app, which returns a hash set to JSON files, apparently. I'm missing the export the app. Okay, never mind. JSON files goes through a parser, which spits out code files, generates files. Not really parser at that point, but more a compiler, generator, or something else. A parser will be part of it because there's a JSON file, but usually a parser means that you take in some serialized data of some sort, be that string, binary, or whatever, and you convert it to some useful domain model of some sort or representation in code. And then your domain logic operates over that, and converting it back to files here would actually technically be a serializer again. Though in this case, probably more a compiler, transpiler, depending on how we want to get hung up on terminology. And we can see this is in C#, or at least it generates C# code. Since the project is helping me to improve my developer skill, I decided to build it with C#. And there's the answer, because I am more used to OOP style and C#. But since I'm writing a parser and serializer, the tool doesn't really matter that much. I can take the generated JSON file and write the parser in any other language like Kotlin, Java, Go, and even C, even though writing in C would be painful. I'm not sure if this specific. I would need to see the code if that would be actually painful in C. I decided to use lit. I don't know lit, so we'll see if I look at it at all. And there are some cases where I have to reinvent the wheel, like coding client-side routing, but I'm totally fine with it. Okay, so that's the README. We have a rough understanding of what it's supposed to do. Let's start with the program CS. I just like to look at the entry point, just so that we know what it roughly does. And in C#, that is the main that you know from Java, or the librs or main rs from Rust, or main from Python, or whatever. It's the application start. So OpenAPI, for those that don't know, is formerly Swagger UI. Well, Swagger and Swagger UI. I'm guessing this is the UI part. Create scope. We just test if we can connect to a database and do absolutely nothing with that. I'm assuming this is debug code. We are generating path into file path. Okay. So we have a serializer which takes in formatting, which takes in a model. Sorry, we have just an instance of the serializer. We're gonna look at it in a second. This file isn't that much longer. We have a model, presumably with a name and apparently fields. We have another model. And then we have relationships between models. I'll probably have something to say to that in a second. We serialize it, so presumably this is just a JSON serializer. We then parse it, and we already saw that parsing in this case means generating. So I'm assuming at this point we are ending up with code. We also see that we're putting in the file paths here. I'm assuming file path is where we generate the specification file to, and dir path is where we are generating the actual application into. Okay. So there's 2 points of interest: the serializer, the parser, and the model and relationships. Does this work in GitHub? I'm not sure. No, it doesn't. Okay, so models, presumably it's in here. So a model is a thing that has fields and relations. It also has a name, which is not a property, but there's a domain model. Here, we're indeed using JSON serializer. And the name is hidden in here, which is not allowed to be null. Yeah, okay, sure. If it's not allowed to be null, I'm not sure why we're initializing it here, because that seems like a potential bug if we ever forget actually setting this. So null exclamation point just tells C#, even though this is a null, don't treat it as a null, so just believe there's a name in here. We could have instead also gone for string.empty, which is just an empty string. But if you ever forget to set this somewhere, the compiler doesn't tell you about it, so I do not have an editor for that. Let me just grab a notepad. So it would be better to have the domain object itself have a actual constructor. Can I change the language? There's certainly a C# in here, right? Yes. And just public domain object string name. Public string name get set, and we could even make this an init, I believe. Because it's questionable if we ever want to change it other than when we create the object. Like, can you rename one? And then here we can just set name equals to name. And then when we're using it in the model, for example, here, we're just gonna copy this. We could then instead that, was it base? Wait, I don't recall in C# how you call the parent constructor. I'm just gonna use this syntax because that one I know. I mostly use that syntax at work right now. I do have the misfortune of working with C#, but you can just stick all of that in here. And then pass off on the name, which is in this case uppercase apparently. And then you don't need the constructor at all. And these values you can then assign. Right, because this could be potentially null apparent. Oh, this also. Yeah. That just makes it a bit safer. I'm not sure if fields. Yeah, it's fine. You don't need to initialize them here if you're setting them in the only constructor, because they're always going to be overwritten. Another thing that's just there, if the indentation ever annoys you, you can also just write namespace semicolon and then remove the brackets, and then everything else is in that namespace. Or was it use namespace? I don't know. That's what code generation is for. So anyway, we have a hash set of model field and relationships. What's a model field? That has a name, a type, which is optional. It's nullable and can be secret, presumably for things like passwords. As in for logging and printing out things. I don't think this should be nullable. Any field should have a type. Now you could have a special type that says this has no type, for whatever reason, like TypeScript has that, but another thing I'm noticing, we're talking here about hash sets. And one thing you cannot have in C# is two fields with the same name. So a hash set is not necessarily wrong, though I'd probably rather use a dictionary with a model name to its properties, but that is fine. The thing here, though, is there's no equals and there is no hash function defined for a public class. It's not a record class. Record class is automatically generated for you. That would still be insufficient because they would do that over all properties, and we really only want to latch onto the name. Or we need to check otherwise in the creation here, in the constructor here, to make sure that no fields are in here twice. Now that doesn't work because this is a public hash set, so any code from outside can change that. So you could protect that by having a function here with called add field, where you add a field and then it can check whether a field of that name already exists. But we really have no benefit using hash set here without defining a hash function or and equals, because it's just going to use object reference identity in this case. Then we had the relationship, which has again a name, which is null. Target model, which is null, and relationship type. So it should probably also be a record type, and it should it should implement a hash function and equality, because it's also in a hash set. And you also cannot have, presumably, two same named relationships to different things. We need to look at the code that gets generated from this, because it's quite possible that the time gets like appended to the relationship or something, and then it's a unique name in the generated code. One to one, one to many, many to one, many to many. I guess that's fine. Here's a parse domain object, which is a hash set of domain objects. Okay, again, the hash set here for the domain object does not implement, none of them implement an equality or hash code function, so the hash set here is also not going to help us. We're going to have the same model with the same name, and unless we have some namespacing that allows to differentiate us, you cannot have two classes with the same name. So there's a few issues around surrounding all of that. But we know now what the model looks like. It's pretty simple. You have just a list of names and relations. And then I'm guessing we'll find it in here. There's the serializer. All it does, it takes in the domain object or a set of domain objects. Objects, we're creating an anonymous type, I guess. And then we're creating a serializer, and we use a enum string converter, because usually enums could be, I don't know what the default is. They might be converted to numbers. I think the default is to numbers because we use that all over our code base as well. And then we're just serializing it according to the data and objects, options, and the serialize here itself is writing it all to file. I would not call that serialization anymore. Serialization to me always implies that you're just getting a string back or a array of some sort or a collection of some sort. Like the thing is serialized. If it's to string, then a string. If it's to binary, then probably binary array or binary stream, which you can then write to. So basically, I would consider this the serialize function and not that. In this case, usually I don't really care much about naming, and it's like whatever works for you. But in this case, because serialize is such a ubiquitous term, I would probably stick to it. Because you see the JSON serializer itself uses it as well as the to a string variant, not to a file. Maybe just call it write to file. Or persist or something like that. Anyway, we saw that the other thing is when the parser grabs the project. This is hard-coded. But we're never using it? I'm assuming this is a leftover. This is also a leftover. Because they're both private, so we're going to ignore them. Parser is probably not going to be very exciting. It just grabs a... Yeah, see, parse should usually return an object type as well. It's okay. Whatever. We're just reading it with a JSON stream reader. And then deserialize it to our objects. And let me figure out where the brackets stop. There, this is the serialization, deserialization. We're creating a hash set, and then for every object and main objects, if object is a model, so we're doing checking against is anything else inheriting the main object? No. Weather forecast controller. That is the standard default scaffolding from Microsoft. That's the front end. So there is no other thing here. So this is a bit redundant, unnecessary, unless there's going to be other things in here. Because the serializer here returns as only valid domain objects, unless we are allowing the user to custom extend domain objects, then I guess this becomes relevant. But that should really not be allowed, because then the parser can't do anything with that anyway. It would then need to implement a specific interface instead, and then you can go generate class on that interface or something like that. And then this would still be redundant, because then you would check against the interface instead. We are generating the class, which does something, generating a DB context and generate controller class templates. Controllers are API controllers, presumably. Generate class takes in a set, interesting, but we're always only calling it with a single value. So why are we not just filtering this by the type and then just calling it with all of them? Okay. Anyway, for item and models, we are going to look at the fields, generate the relations. We're picking a random indentation and generating a class. Public class item name, new line field. So there's never a check done if a name is repeated. So this could result in invalid code being generated. Unless the check is in here. We'll see. And then we're creating a file name and write all text to that file name by file name. Yeah, but if the model name is in here twice, you're just going to end up with the last one you see. It's going to overwrite it, which is not the best. Just ignore that. Generate fields. For field, we're going to through all of them. If it's secret, we are adding a JSON ignore. This is for the API at the end. And then if it's nullable or not, we're going to add the required type and then the item name. So we're also not checking here. So this can also, whereas this here only overrides stuff, this actually just leads to broken classes, potentially. And then field set adds that to that, and yeah, okay. And generate relations, I imagine, is similar. We're going through the relationship type. And then we have same thing, just as a list if it's one-to-many or many-to-many, and many-to-one it's a single, and one-to-one it's a single. I'm wondering if many-to-one may be nullable theoretically. Same with 1-to-1. Theoretically, it depends on the semantics one wants to define here. But 1-to-1 technically just says if there's a relationship between models, it's model A is going to only reference model B, and model B is only going to reference model A. But that doesn't mean there are two models referencing each other. For example, if you have only one model, it's not going to reference any other model. Well, it could reference itself, I guess. Similar thing with many-to-one. If there are many objects that can point at this one, but there are no objects that are actually pointing at this one. Sorry, many of these objects can point to a different one. But if there is no different one to point at, or if there, yeah, that's the only relevant one, then this one would also be not existent. So it should be null. So that should be, both of those should probably be nullable. And that's just C# jank. Because in C# enums aren't actually true enums. They're just an integer with labels, and you can instantiate completely validly and legally without anything complaining. So for example, this is number 0, 1, 2, 3. So you could create a relationship path of enum 42 and it'll work without any complaints ever. Don't ask me why they thought that is a good idea. Anyway, we know what those look like now. So it just adds them in here and indents them. And then we're calling generate db context, which is down here. using the EF core. New line, select model, public DB set. Okay, that just creates the standard C# DB sets, and then we're just writing that out without any other helper functions or classes. This, that's fine. And then there was generate controller class template, which is a whole bunch of things. Controller name, template. I don't really expect anything exciting in here. I want to return back to a thing I saw earlier. We're injecting the context directly into the controller. Having mentioned clean in the README, that is technically not considered clean because it's mixing the responsibilities at this point. You'd probably want to inject a service instead, and that has context of a database. It's also not inverted because that is an actual type, not an interface. If we care about things like clean. And then we are generating get all by ID, post, put, delete. Okay. And let's write it out. Post is just a HTTP post, produces response type 201 created and a 400 action results, name, create parameter name, and name to lower. Okay. And the first letter of that. Do we have collisions here? No, we have only one model. So it really doesn't matter. We could have also hard-coded random. Letters here. But doesn't that yield confusing API names then? Because it calls create P for post, for example. Yeah, okay. Then we are getting the context, just adding it and calling save changes. Arguable if all of that should be async code, but we have only one context. And then we're just returning the ID of what we created. Get by ID presumably does the same thing. It just grabs it from context. Parameter name is presumably the ID here. And then we're doing the same thing for Javas. They're not that interesting at that point. Put is more interesting because it should do an update. If it's not there, bad request. Wait, if ID unequals parameter name ID. Parameter name. All right, sure. That just should never be possible. We don't need the ID. So if the object we're putting already has the ID in it, then we shouldn't accept the ID here, because that is completely redundant at that point and only causes potential problems like this one. If you remove this, then this entire failure path doesn't exist, which removes the bad request response just completely because it doesn't exist anymore. Nothing else produces bad request. So I'd rather just delete that and delete this. Or since we're generating code, we could also generate a DTO here of this model without the ID itself. So we are just having, which just contains the data itself and contains then we can have the ID over here. But that would still get rid of that. We're just checking if it exists. If it exists, is null, return not found, entry, save changes. So there can be a race condition here between find and save changes over here. Because something else could, in theory, in the meantime, delete this item after you pulled it out of context. Possibly something to consider. Okay, let's take another look at the program. I have something to mention here. That is the model here has a name, which is okay. But the relationship here has magic strings at this point. We could easily just use the model itself, have this actually point at real models as object types. And then it would be guaranteed that this relationship is always valid. It never points to a name that doesn't exist. So we could put in here the... Never mind the name, sorry, the target is the one that matters. So we could put into this one here this model 1 as a property. And that would be fine. Yeah. Now, one thing that I didn't see, and that is you need to be careful if you define a one-to-one relationship or many-to-one. Actually, let's look at the add relationship code. Model 2 relations add. Oh no, we're just adding it. Many-to-one. We don't have a reverse one. So in AF Core, you usually have a reverse field as well, right? So the user, the post model here would have a many-to-one to user, and the user would have a one-to-many in to the post. That can be automatically generated without any issues, just not in the structure because it doesn't know about the user. Now, if you had the user model in here, you could again do that. That whenever you go through this, when you generate the classes, it could analyze it beforehand and realize, oh, I need to add it to the other model, or the function itself here have a function here that says add this relation, and then it adds to the relationship set in both of them at the same time. That's something to consider as well. Yes. I would also consider turning these potentially into, let's go to the classes, potentially into builders of some sort, because there might be extra properties like authorization that we want to add onto this, right? Other parsing, other parameters, other properties. There might be things here that might make this more flexible, where we want to add that on specifically as either attributes or maybe even in the code. For example, checking if a user has a specific right to even access to create an object, for example. Yeah. So those are my thoughts, more or less ad hoc. I hope that helps. And you know how to reach me. Have fun.